So, Haley, Marissa, Andy, before we get started, you're each wearing a ribbon. We're gonna do the ritual for carrying that ribbon first. Okay. So let me just No, it's fine. It's fine right now. We don't need to. It's fine.
Oh, really?
Okay. So, Andy,
So not even
I'm
this.
gonna say a prayer. I'm gonna say Hebrew prayer, and then I'm gonna say something in English, and you're gonna say Amen. Okay? And then we're gonna tear your ribbons, and you're gonna do that by placing your hands at the bottom, and I'll help you and pull in opposite directions when it's time. Okay? So the ribbon represents your heart, and it's a way of putting on the outside what you feel on the inside. It's a reminder for you, and a sign for the community that you're in mourning. Okay? So, Baruch atah Adonai Dayan, and that the hearts that are torn, we perform this act of kriyah, tearing. Say Amen. Amen. You're going to take your hands, put them at the bottom, and pull up and down if you can. You need two hands for that.
I was turning.
No problem. Got it? Yeah. Perfect. Just put your hands at the bottom. Can I help you? It's all right. It's very important.
We're about to begin the services. Mr. Sidney Bernard Zwick, just an announcement before we begin. For those of you present here at the cemetery, please make sure that your cell phones are either on silent or turned off completely. That would be appreciated. Just turn it on the silent mode, that's all. In the Shiva, there will be in-person Shiva Thursday, today, September 9th, from 12:30 to 3:30, and from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., with a minyan at 7:30 p.m. That's a gathering in the backyard of the Hopkins home, and please, masks are required indoors regardless of your vaccination status, and that is at the Hopkins residence at 612 Old Elm Road in Highland Park, and please park on either University Avenue or Summit Avenue. The services will be officiated by Rabbi Wendy Geffen from North Shore Congregation Israel, and we will begin the service with military honors from the United States Army.
Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our friends. Each of us has a name given by our longing and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our struggles. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. Death has taken our beloved Sidney. Filled with grief and loneliness, we pray that his family finds comfort and consolation from community and from each other. For Sidney's love that we experienced in life, for his companionship that we shared along life's path, for all that we remember, in particular the gifts of his heart and mind, all of that brought joy and happiness. We commit these to our hearts as precious remembrances. And in that spirit, we give our thanks to God. It is in this time of grief that we turn to voices, ancient and new, as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death together. Adonai ro'i lo echsar, bino deshe yarbitzeni al me menuchot yanahaleni nafshi yeshovev, yancheni b'ma'ag le'tzedek lema'an shemo. These Hebrew words are of the 23rd Psalm, a source of comfort to so many throughout the ages. You have them, if you are here in person with us, written on the inside of the pamphlet you received. If you are joining us on the internet, perhaps you know these words in your heart. Wherever you are, let's say them aloud together as a sign of our presence here this day. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, but life is a journey. From childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness, ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion, and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength, or strength to weakness, and often back again. From health to sickness and back, we pray to health again. From offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude, pain to compassion, grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until, looking backward or ahead, we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but having made the journey, stage by stage, a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning and death is a destination, but life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage made stage by stage to life everlasting. And from the book of Ecclesiastes, there is a time for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. There is a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve, but a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather them, a time to seek out and a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to discard, a time to tear, but a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. We are here together today, united near and far in memory of Sidney, a son, brother, husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, uncle and friend. A person whose life was both so wide and deep that there would be no way to cover the entirety of it in the time we have together this morning. But we will try to offer remembrance and reflection. And this might give us a picture of the man he was, and more importantly, how he will be remembered in the lives of those who were most dear to him, and to whom he was most dear as well. Sidney was born to his parents, Helen and Harry, in West Frankfort, Illinois, on July 9th, 1926. The younger brother of Bernice, EJ, Elaine, and Ben, and the older brother of Harriet. He also had a sister, Sylvia, who passed away very young in the flu pandemic. As a young boy, Sidney attended a number of kindergartens. His father, Harry, believed deeply in the value of education. Sidney remembered sitting at the dinner table and reading the newspaper aloud, reading the Book of Knowledge before starting school, and memorizing Sen Vest's eulogy on a dog about a legal case as the way he learned to read. After his parents' separation, Sidney and his brother Ben lived with Harry in Evanston, behind Harry's men's clothing store, while his sisters remained with Helen. Always incredibly intelligent, Sidney graduated as his high school valedictorian early, around the age of 15 or 16, and he matriculated to Northwestern University, attending mostly night school. His college education was interrupted when he was drafted into the service during World War II. An eye injury prevented him from active duty, but he served in Fort Lewis, first as a private, and was honorably discharged as a corporal by the end of his term. After a bike trip through the Northwest, Sidney returned to Northwestern on the GI Bill, graduating Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in economics and accounting. He later received a master's degree in political science from the University of Chicago. Professionally, Sidney served as the executive director of the American Youth Hostel program for many years. He later went on to become a history teacher, teaching at Crane Tech for nearly 3 decades. Sidney was a passionate teacher, deeply rooted in the values of education and community service. We'll hear more about that in a few minutes. He saw his students as his kids, and he never let his role with them stop at the school building. Sidney was also an activist. He believed in the importance of being civically and politically involved. He was a thorn in the side of Northwestern, pushing them to pay their fair share in Evanston taxes, and succeeding in getting them to contribute to fire and police protection. He ran for alderman and later started his own local newspaper, The Beacon, too. Sidney and Rosemary also owned and operated a small Evanston business that began by selling bikes and renting skis and boots in the back and holding an art gallery in the front, with it eventually becoming an art gallery alone. It was back in those hosteling years that Sidney would be paired up with Rosemary Goldfine at a folk dance at an American Youth Hostel rally. After courting Rosemary on a tandem bike, the pair got engaged. They waited 1 year, so that Sidney could save up $1,500 for their honeymoon. They married at the Northwestern Student Union on December 26, 1948. Sidney happened to have his first recorder there, a wire recorder, and he interviewed all 50 to 75 guests, including his parents, that day. After the wedding, the couple embarked on a 5-month honeymoon trip all around Europe. They departed on the QE2 and returned on the Queen Mary. Together, they biked all around Europe, except in Germany, where they hitchhiked instead. In Sidney's words, he considered that a graduate course in art. Rosemary presented her passion in a way that really engaged him, and he shared his passion for history and politics with her. Sidney and Rosemary shared many adventures together in their lives, ski trips, bike trips, later family trips where the entire month of August would feature the entire family journeying all over the country, to Canada and Mexico too. There was camping, there were national parks, naturalist sites, countless historic markers. Sidney admired Rosemary for her artistry. Their home in Evanston showcased her art, not on its surface, but rather literally built into it. Although they had very different schedules, with Sidney teaching and Rosemary working through the night, the two would share a cup of coffee together every day at 3 p.m. when Sidney got home from school. Together they shared a 47-year marriage where they navigated the ups and downs of life. They shared a deep connection, and as Rosemary said in her own words, at the bottom of it all, we really like each other. After Rosemary died, a major part of Sidney's life was memorializing her. Selling the home that he and Rosemary shared and raised their family and truly lived their lives in was difficult. And when the home was sold, Sidney became committed to the idea of elevating Rosemary and having her genius recognized. Even in the more recent, more difficult times when Sidney was unwell, just saying Rosemary's name would put a smile on his face, as in the end it was reminiscing, that brought him the most comfort. As a father, Sidney had unique relationships with his children, Samara, Marissa, Andy, and Stephen, and we'll hear in just a few words from many of them. But beyond the individual relationships, in many ways, Sidney was the recorder of his children's lives, the recorder of their family history. He would interview them at different times as they grew, asking what they were doing on a particular day, literally weaving together a video record of the trajectory of their growth. This is something he continued with his grandchildren, too. There were slideshows and family movie nights, literally nights watching family movies, because whatever had been going on, Sidney had captured it in imagery and in video, one of his great passions. As a grandfather, Sidney was blessed to have 4 grandchildren, Nick, Max, Torin, and Kaylee. Sidney loved his grandchildren most deeply. He enjoyed the time he was able to spend with them, and he kept photos of them all at the house, displayed with joy and pride. Sidney and Rosemary proved to be wonderful babysitters when Nicky and Max were young. They hold many cherished memories with their grandpa Sid. And Torin and Kaylee each developed particularly close relationships with their grandfather. From playing at his house to his presence at every event in their lives, they really cherished how involved and present he was. And they loved how he was always interested in them and what they were doing. Sidney was a passionate person. From his love for history and documentation to his lifelong love of cycling, whatever he did it fully. He had a tenacity for understanding technology, and even as technology so rapidly advanced in recent years, he would do his best to try to understand. As Torin said, he always asked relevant questions. It's not too bad. Sidney was strong, and he had a determined will to live. And in his last days, Sidney was able to see Kaylee, the people he loved, and he passed away peacefully after listening to Torin singing Forever and Always with Andy and Marissa by his side. Sidney was not a perfect person. No one is. But Judaism doesn't teach that we should aspire to a life of perfection. It teaches we should aspire to a life of wholeness. Sidney achieved this in his life, something we might understand as a living and enduring legacy, God willing, in the lives of those he loved, who he leaves behind. We'll turn now to the most important voices here, the voices of his family and the words of his family. So first, Marissa.
I'm going to push this just down a bit. Okay? Okay, like that? Yeah. Okay. Good morning, and thank you for being here. I enjoyed a full life from beginning to end with my dad. He was the parent in my life with whom I spent the most time, who facilitated my love of learning, especially experientially, and with whom I shared many adventures. Dad was a complex person with many interests, activities, and dreams. He was a historian, educator, and activist. He was the co-owner of the Four Arts Gallery, where, for the majority of my growing up years, I spent countless hours with Dad. Starting at age 5, spending most Saturdays keeping busy, and through high school graduation where I worked, and he taught me all aspects of the business, including framing art. Dad loved all the arts. He enjoyed folk, jazz, and classical music. When we were young, my parents would take our whole family to live concerts, dance performances, and the theater. Annually, we'd go see the Joffrey Ballet at the Auditorium Theater, where we'd always sit so high up in the highest balcony that I would literally shake and crawl to my seat because I had a terrible fear of heights. This and taking music lessons was their way to ensure their children would have appreciation for the arts. As a child, Dad was my nurturer. He was the one who bathed us two or three at a time. He had us say prayers before going to sleep and tucked us in. For me, his was always the side of the bed I would go to if I wasn't feeling well or had a nightmare in the middle of the night. Dad always made us breakfast on weekends. In fact, a couple of days ago, I made sunny side up eggs, one of Dad's specialties. I used butter for a change and discovered that was the secret to having crispy edges around the whites that I always wanted and Dad delivered. He also often offered me carrots with horseradish, something he liked. He said it would grow hair on my chest. And since I wanted to be like my dad, I ate them that way too, painful though it was. But what Dad and I shared most was his infinite pleasure in the out of doors, including skiing, bicycling, camping, and his passion for travel. Dad and I shared a love of bicycle riding. Of course, he taught me how to ride on our balloon tire blue two-wheeler that all four of us learned on. Always the guy on top of bicycle trends, when I was around 8 years old, he surprised me with a new yellow Japanese-made folding bicycle, a one-of-a-kind cool bike. Around age 12, he gave me a blue Rally 3-speed. The last, when I was in high school, was my bright orange 10-speed Jeton. It was a road bike with narrow tires, racing handlebars, and a very narrow leather seat that took a getting used to. When I was in my junior or senior year in high school, Dad shocked me when at midnight he invited me to take a bike ride. I will never forget that ride up the North Shore from our home in Evanston. A dark, cool midsummer's night with an earthy, sweet smell in the air. No one was on the road, just me and Dad. As a young adult living back in Evanston after college, Dad and I took sailing lessons together at Northwestern University. We sailed little sunfish two-person boats. Part of the class was to flip the boat and right it again. Well, ours completely turtled. So there we were in Lake Michigan, fully clothed, that was part of the exercise, trying first to get on top of the slippery hull and then flip the boat. Somehow it was very comical to us, and yes, we somehow managed to successfully right the boat. I think it's safe to say that one of the most memorable things in all of our lives were our family vacations, the first of which was to the World's Fair in Montreal in 1967. Every year thereafter, we'd spend 3 to 4 weeks in August just going off in a general direction. We always primitive camped, visited national parks, and stopped at many historical landmarks that we called hysterical landmarks just to tease my dad. The thing I enjoyed most, however, were the early mornings with Dad on these trips. He and I were the early birds, who would often sit in lawn chairs together and watch the sunrise. After a while, he would take out a map, lay it on the front hood of the car, and he'd ask, "Where do you think we should go next?" February 3rd, 1995, at age 69, my mother died quickly and unexpectedly of a cerebral hemorrhage. My parents were having their regular late afternoon coffee together when she felt strange and started slurring her words. Dad shared, quote, Rosemary's life ended too soon, but I still experience her to this day, to this hour. Close quote. Torin was age 3 and Kaylee was 1. After my mom died, the woman Dad described as, quote, beautiful inside and out, close quote, he progressively diminished, gained weight, and ultimately became immobile. While he was still physically able, however, he attended all of my children's activities, our Jewish and secular holidays, birthdays, and we even all went to Europe together twice. Grandpa adored and spent countless hours with Torin and Kaylee, literally from their birth to his death. In fact, with regard to Kaylee, Dad often referred to himself as my almost midwife. Long story short, Dad was the only person I could reach when I went into labor with Kaylee midday. She could have easily been born in his car. It was so close that by the time he parked the car at the hospital, she was already swaddled in my arms. My kids loved Grandpa as much as he loved them. As adults, they visited and called him often when he was far away at the Mantino VA home. On day 1 of our vigil of Dad's last days, both Torin and Kaylee were at his bedside, Torin virtually and Kaylee physically. On August 27th, 2021, we played the song that Torin wrote for him, and minutes later, at 7:30 p.m., Sidney died peacefully with Marissa, Andrew, and Dan by his side. Dad lived a long, full life, and I will forever carry him in my heart.
So she got through that a lot better than I will. Just putting that out there. Good morning, and thank you all for joining our family today. I had the great honor of being Grandpa's only granddaughter. With that came privileges. Although other grandkids were incredibly special to him, I remember him specifically taking me to the theater, and we would have our own little matinee dates. The first show he ever took me to was Romeo and Juliet at the Shakespeare Theater. My grandfather had his own newspaper called the Evanston Beacon. The Beacon would advertise for the Shakespeare Theater, and he would receive tickets to the shows. I was the beneficiary of most of those tickets. You see, my bond and Torin's bond with Grandpa was incredibly special. For us, he was the only grandfather we ever knew. Our father's father had passed away before my parents were married, so when Torin and I were born, we knew absolutely no one else. And I think my grandpa knew it. Without question or hesitation, Grandpa came to everything. He came to every baseball game, every show I ever performed in, filmed my gymnastics routines, and probably more than I can remember in this moment. My memories of Grandpa are of him in the kitchen of his home, talking about the tile work that Grandma had done in the kitchen, with the small TV playing the news or playing the radio on NPR. It was always one of the two, unless there was something special on something related to history. My grandfather loves history, but he was also the type to try to affect history. You see, if Grandpa did not like a situation, he did not sit back and do nothing about it. He would contact the alderman or write an opinion piece, but either way, he used his voice. Grandpa knew that we could not wait for the change that we wished to see in this world, and he actively sought after it. What I didn't know was that my grandfather was in law school before Samara was born. He wasn't able to finish his first year, but he did take constitutional law. I remember telling my grandfather, "Hey, Grandpa, I have good news," to which he said, "You're engaged?" Nope, not yet. But I got into law school and I started in January, which was when he told me that he went, but dropped out when Samara was born. He told me constitutional law was his favorite class. So naturally, after taking my first semester of it, I went to visit Grandpa to discuss. Mind you, this was a year ago, and he still remembered the cases. We discussed Marbury v. Madison, and he knew the facts. My mother kept turning to me to see if he was right, and he was. The case was so clear in his mind that he could have presented the case in class with me. I was privileged to be able to debate these cases with my grandpa. I had no idea where my passion for justice and change came from, and then it hit me. We were sitting as a family talking about Grandpa's funeral, and Samara mentioned his drive and passion for politics and change. Of course, the con law was his favorite subject because he actively used his First Amendment right in his everyday life. Every time he published the newspaper or when he marched with his students alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he embodied that right and used his voice in a way to change this world in a time when most would not have. He saw injustice in this world and actively worked to change it. He was the change he saw in this world. He was the potential we could have, and unlike most, he went out and fought for it. I was the lucky one to have him as a grandfather. I was the lucky one to be able to learn that others are valued. And if you see the wrong in this world, you cannot sit back and do nothing, because he showed me that we all have a voice. And if he wasn't vocalizing it, then he was writing about it. I was the lucky one who got to visit him before he died. And I was the lucky one because the last thing he said to me was, "I love you."
Andy, would you like to go?
Dan, do you want to? Yeah, it's just pointed in my direction, Dan. Thank you. Dan, you're photographing yourself. Turn it around. Okay. Okay. And make sure you see me. I'm not the world's most handsome guy anymore, but just keep it focused on my talk. Okay. I have a bit of well, I guess I should. I'm not going to wing it too much. I think I'm going to just read it. I'm 58 years old, and my father and my mother created me, and I was born in 1962, and I've spent 58 years with Sidney Bernard Zwick. I guess we will begin with the good memories of my father when I was a child. Obviously, I've known my dad my whole life. When I was a child, I used to have a lot of fun with my father. Probably the most fun were the summer camping trips. The first one I remember actually in Michigan. We had a big, bus sort of truck, and there were some crawfish in the campground. The first really cool one was the Montreal Expo trip of 1967. Watching the ships come through the canal near our camp. Fun. I remember Belgian waffles and losing my brother in the amusement park. That happened more than a few times on our trips, on other ones. And some of the coolest architecture I'd ever seen, which may have inspired my dream to be an architect and my lifelong love of architecture. The next one was the old slob trip. Basically, our car engine was blowing and we couldn't make it up Pikes Peak. So I think my dad left everybody out of the car and a couple people went up. And we were within the Holiday Inn because when I was a kid, those swimming pools, we would stay at a hotel once or twice. I got to stick to script. This is long. And I became aware of the Vietnam War in 1968 on that trip. There was a wounded soldier at a Dairy Queen, and I looked right, I said, what's the matter? You have half a foot. And his reply very simply was landmine, and I haven't forgotten it. And the Mexico trip in 1972 was really amazing, seeing the ruins. There were many, many others, I don't know. My parents loved to ski, and my father told me recently that he first learned to ski as a soldier when a friend took him skiing in Mount Hood in Oregon when he was stationed in Washington. I have loved skiing my whole life due to this. My father didn't want us to be spoiled and self-centered, and I had to at least cut the lawn to get an allowance. He taught me mat cutting at the gallery when I was 13, and as a result, he instilled a work ethic in me. I'm a very hard worker, and he often took me on service trips with his students. They were always bicycling often, and of course the youth hostels. My father loved to bicycle, and I have internalized his compassion for the poor and disadvantaged. He often took me into the projects to pick up his students, but never to school. I think it was too dangerous. During the King assassination riots, my father told me his students surrounded his car to protect it. And he told me when I got older that the Black Panthers punched a teacher's teeth out and put up death lists in the cafeteria. One brilliant comment he told me 5 or 6 years ago is that the projects were safe in the 1970s until the gangs started selling drugs in the 1980s. It wasn't welfare as our politicians and media led you to believe. It was a big lie. Unfortunately, during my teens, I had a very adversarial relationship, and as a result, I had a very high level of anger that developed into paranoid schizophrenia when I moved to Colorado. But when I returned home in 2009 to take care of him, all that anger just completely vanished. And I could see my father for who he really was, a very good man. I was mind blown by his sales and marketing, and I'll go off script. I mean, he almost got Olive Garden to buy my mother's artwork, and there was one time he ran an ad in our new newspaper, and we had 10 customers, and I was for changing VCRs to DVDs. It was really remarkable. And I realized he was last in a long line of Eastern European Jewish peddlers. Grandpa Harry taught Dad his peddling skills. He did a lot of crazy things. I'm not going to tell you all 6 and 7. The first really crazy thing he did was I had a beat up old car that everybody in my family told me to sell. Unfortunately, I had no money to pay for it due to the banking crisis, and he towed it. I was working at the zoo, and he told it to the Ford dealer to have it assessed. And I got into trouble because I said I could murder you for towing my car, and that is assault charges. But he didn't press charges. I had to spend 24 hours at my friend's house. It's ridiculously funny in hindsight. And also, I was desperate for a job, and this chicken wings place was finally going to hire me as a delivery. And he was at a assisted living Sunrise up in High, and he tied up their phone lines. And he was telling, it cost me the job, but he was telling him he wanted to charge them $40 a day for the use of his car. But what's so funny about my father is he's right. We shouldn't tolerate such an exploitive economic system to give in to cynicism or become little Eichmanns. A truly vicious comment by a professor at CU, but ignoring it because we are comfortable and successful. If it hadn't been for my dad, I would have never had or thought or had these values. Boy, did my father know American history. I can't remember, when Lincoln came out, that was a great year for movies, many good ones. Life of Pi. And actually, when we were watching Lincoln, my father said Thaddeus Stevens' wife was mulatto, not black. Before 1871, we were more like South Africa and other countries. It was a white-black mulatto world, not a white and black world, the world I grew up. And watching the Rio Olympics, my father opined that Catholic slavery was much less brutal. The Rio de Janeiro Olympics in 16, I think, or 14, than Protestant slavery. The Catholic Church said a slave's soul could not be owned. Also, when we watched a show on James Garfield, and had he lived, we would have been way ahead in our race relations. Garfield was very progressive on race relations. And tragically, he was assassinated by a man who wanted a job. And what was interesting, there was this conflict between the Conklins and the Stalwart branches, and my father knew it right out. He knew who the Stalwarts, he knew they didn't like Conklin. I might be wrong on that, it's been a while, but and I kept all his tests. They were college-level professor tests. Those tests had some really hard questions. One of his students, and maybe Marissa remembers his last name better, I believe it was Roosevelt Meekins, but I remember, he told me my father was the best teacher he'd ever had. I'm almost at a point where I'd like to sing, because the song Imagine, and I just have a couple notes I want to interject at this point. We had one truly great conversation a couple summers, and then a lot of crazy things, starting with a car accident, broken teeth, COVID, a couple characters telling me something in private. And I was out camping, and he was a little depressed for the first couple days. He wasn't happy at the VA. And by the third day of my being there, and we had a truly great conversation. I was telling my father I was, 56 years old, and I didn't have a wife and kids, and, with my hair turning gray, the girls, even though I'm still have some very pretty eyes thanks to my mom, it's getting harder to find girls. And he said, and then he reflected, he actually was cleared to get his PhD when he got his master's. And my father said it's never too late. And I think that when I posted on Facebook, some of those, after he died, and there was also some very funny comments. He also made me watch every Ken Burns documentary there is. This is important, he would tell me. So, as I watched my father dying, there's something in Zen. I've been a Buddhist, and when I get to John Lennon, I don't agree with him on religion. And I also want to say, with the military here, I still have a huge amount of respect for the military, largely because we aren't there yet. We aren't there. The world is a tough neighborhood, the communists and us, but we seem to be going at a point. And I have we need the military, and I don't want to dismiss them in the short run. I mean, it's just a pragmatic fact. We have to, until the world evolves, maybe not in my life. We're very close. But I want to digress back to that point. I just felt I needed to say that. So I watched my dad, and one of the mysterious things in Zen mind, beginner mind, is he says we die and we don't die. And when I saw my father dying, the last half hour was a bit rough. I'd rather not go into details. But I kind of got it. He says we die and we don't die. And I saw my father's physical side dying, and I kept him company for a few days after he died. And his spiritual side didn't die. And I still feel that. And it all made sense to me. And I told him, I can't, when he was dying, because he cried, and I told him we really cannot physically, scientifically yet rule out reincarnation, or for that matter, the resurrection. Strangely, it comes in the book of Revelation during the reign of the saints. And I don't want to lose it. Or, that I told him that heaven is maybe something we create in the future. Forgive me, I'm a little bit of a Christian. I have my mother to thank for that. And this is a Jewish funeral, and we'll get to the prayer. She knows. And he flirted with Joel Osteen for a little while, but he went back to being Jewish. I was hearing gossip. Heaven's a very nice thing if you're dying. But anyways, maybe heaven is something we create in the future, that we will all somehow know each other in the future. And black holes don't make sense. There are strange phenomenons. They can't explain subatomic particles, how neutrons, and part of it is they can't get relativity and quantum mechanics to integrate, both at the subatomic and at the black hole level, which is so fascinating. Black holes theoretically are singularities. That means they have no space. How could something that exerts? All right, so Marissa's given me, get back to the main issue. Okay, so anyway, we'll get in, let's get to the next. And I really think like I'm having issues, and I don't want to bring that into this, but I want to read John Lennon's song, Imagine, because I want people to see what we can be. And I said to my brother-in-law, whatever you may think about the myths of religion, what's really strange about prayer and what I do meditation is from the start, it makes people more altruistic. It's a real weird phenomenon. And you don't have to worry about all the myths and, stoning people to death. People to value it. So let's get to John Lennon's song. Okay, I'm just going to read it. Imagine there is no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. Imagine all people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed and hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may see I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us. The world will be a one. It is a truly great song. And it seems like in the media, the politicians are catching up with me. And I know Marissa kind of cut close. So the other thing is, I have a novel in my head, and I believe my life's in danger, and I'm leaving it out of this funeral. And for me, death isn't too far away if my fears of tuberculosis are true. Let me finish, Marissa. I'm only digressing for a couple seconds. And I think you have to realize death is very much a part of my life. And for some reason, I'm glad Kylie and Lynn are sharing my tears that I thought I would feel. And for some reason, I think I'm probably mostly at peace because he didn't suffer for very long when he died. And I think that comforted me. When he was in hospice care, I couldn't get out of bed. I thought he would suffer. And I'm very glad he didn't. So there was a childhood prayer my father taught me when I was a child. And I didn't say it correctly at first, but I remembered. And he gave me the prayer, and it's called Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Bless our dear parents, bless all good people, amen. I just want to say some of my relatives and aunt said my father was a terrible person. While I don't agree, especially the last 10 years. While he wasn't perfect, he was a very good man. And I want you to know that he was a very good man who did a lot of good. Amen. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Andy. I have a few words to read from Samara, Paul, Nick, and Max. This is Samara's memory of one vacation moment. One summer out west, when the summer I turned 15, we are somewhere in Arizona, I think, in the desert. Broad blue sky, mesas on the horizon, rolling weeds, very hot, very dry. Our station wagon is loaded up as usual for our summer family camping trips. Kids, camping gear, coolers, pillows, no air conditioning, all the windows wide open. My dad doing the driving as usual, my mom riding shotgun, reading something. Marissa has the middle seat. Me and my brothers are in what we always referred to as the way back, and as oldest, I claimed the premium space by the rear tailgate window. Note, no seat belts back in 1969. Andrew and Stephen are trying to keep cool by soaking towels in water from a cooler and throwing them on each other. Then Dad pulls off the road onto the shoulder and gets out of the car, walks ahead of the car maybe 10 feet or so. After who knows how long, my mom looks up and says, "Samara, hop out of the car and go see why we're stopped and what your father is doing." I get out of the car by crawling through the tailgate window, and I walk up to my dad, who is staring off into the distance, and he says to me, "Imagine how the pioneers must have felt coming out through here in their wagons." After a few more minutes, when I joined him in staring at the horizon, we both got back in the car and the trip continues. Paul's memory of how to start Sid's old car. Paul's memory of starting Sidney's old Peugeot station wagon. Sidney lent us his car on some occasion. Don't remember why. Probably our car was in the shop if we had one at the time. He gave us the key and I went to start the car. The key wouldn't even turn. I went back in, told him I couldn't get the car started, and he said, "All you have to do is put your wrist against the turn signal, push up on the steering wheel, push the gear shift with your elbow, and turn the key. Don't you know how to start a car by now?" Here is Nick's memories of Grandpa Sid. When I think of my grandfather, I imagine him in the jam-packed bedroom turned TV room. He had recently recorded the latest Itzhak Perlman performance on PBS. He would be talking non-stop. I was half listening, but the main point was he wanted me to watch the performance as inspiration to become a better violinist. He would study the TV guide to know what he wanted to record next, and I guess he'd eventually find space on the overflowing shelves to store another VHS tape. Later on, as I got older and lost interest in playing the violin, he'd have a confused tone and tell me how he doesn't understand how rap music is music. "It's poetry, not music, Nikki. They're not singing," he'd say. I heard that statement nearly 100 times on a road trip he took me on to explore distant family and historical sites on the East Coast during the summer of 1995. It was on this road trip that I saw my grandfather in ways that weren't his usual encouraging to grandkids, happy-go-lucky self. For most of my childhood, I saw the best of him, a documentarian, an advocate, an enthusiast of so many things, and a person who deeply loved his family, especially his children. Spending time, just the two of us, in a car for hours on end, I saw him as the rule bender who took liberty over accessible soda fountains in fast food restaurants with his oversized thermos. I saw him as the actor who blamed his new car and all its fancy technology as the reason the officer should forgive him and give him a warning, not a ticket. I saw him as a proud dad showing off his son's latest architecture and asking what else could he get us in for free. I saw him as a person who valued family relationships near and far as we ventured out of the way to visit relatives. I also saw him as a person who was devastated by the loss of his wife as he teared up in line waiting for a tour of Monticello, sharing cycling memories of my grandmother. I saw him as someone who could be irresponsible as I walked the streets of Baltimore searching for a payphone to call home as I hadn't seen him for hours. I saw him as human, far from perfect, but in all ways passionate about so many things. And from Max. Dear Grandpa Sidney, thanks for taking such an interest in my life, for being there to record our family memories. Though my memories of times with you are few, I won't forget our trip to the Smoky Mountains. We sat next to each other on a whitewater raft, paddling over the white-capped river. Walked among the towering rainforest trees and rhododendrons, watching snakes wind their way up craggy bark. We took in the misty view from our mountain cabin and breathed the blue, moist air every morning. And though my memories of the times we spent together are few, I will also remember always your voice, narrating my youth hockey games, wondering at what I must be thinking out there in all that gear. Our family holidays, guessing at what everyone must be talking about or thinking while we shared our Thanksgiving and Passover meals. My brother and I rolling out wet clay into snakes and turtles, while our grandmother watched over our shoulder. On the leftover recordings of presentations and local gatherings from the video camera you gave me. Thank you for being my grandfather. With love, your grandson, Max. Last we'll hear from Torin.
Hello. Today we've heard stories about Sidney Zwick and the beautiful life he shared with all of us. But I'd like to share an angle that is personal to me and is demonstrative of the magical kind of man I saw my grandfather to be. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, Rosemary Zwick, my grandmother, suffered a stroke that would take her life. As a 4-year-old, I had a hard time comprehending who my grandmother was and what she meant to my family. As many of you know, my grandmother was a prolific artist who spent a very serious career in art. And a number of years after her passing, the gallery, where my grandparents would spend many hours collecting, making, and selling art, would be sold. This was the first step I realized towards losing my grandmother. You see, I don't really remember my grandma, but I got to know her after she died, because she lived on through her art. Pieces she collected, art she'd made, adventures, hours of labor, stories of humanity filled my grandfather's home. The color, the smell of clay, random beautiful objects like colorful stones, and artifacts from distant lands spoke volumes about the kind of people my grandparents were. Adventurers, creators, educators, activists, and a passion unmatched. He treasured her and cherished her deeply, the kind of love you really only find in movies. He continued to love her, and I saw him fighting every day to continue living a life with Rosemary. He would talk about hosteling and what he could do to help expose young minds to the world of travel. He discussed the music he loved, the art he shared from what he learned from my grandmother, and brought an energy to the conversation that I know he would have loved to share with Rosemary. My grandfather and I spent countless hours discussing life, love, technology, the future, even subjects he knew little about, that he could miraculously grasp very quickly and conversationally. My grandfather, my grandmother were a beautiful couple, and I'm not saying it was without arguments or other things, but it was so strong that it kept him alive for about 25 more years after her passing. And in those 25 years, he was not only able to teach me, but could show me who he was and who my grandmother was. He taught me what it means to live a life of passion, a life of love, and a life worth loving. Through her art, through his action, and through his words, he introduced me to my grandmother and subsequently himself. Since then, he inspired me to write an album that I wrote with my sister to share with my children and grandchildren one day. The day I got the news that my grandfather was ready to pass, I was shook. Not because I didn't see it coming, but because I wasn't ready to let him go. Within the last few hours of his death, a song came to me that I was able to record and I was able to send to him. A last gift I could give. And I like to think of it as part of his world that now lives on. I like to imagine that his presence will be felt for the rest of our lives, whether it is in music, art, impassioned living, or love. This invaluable lesson of life and love that he taught me through story and art, I would like to share with you now in the last song I played for my grandfather, forever and always. The lyrics are actually in your packet. If you want to follow there. It's a lot. I was gonna, yeah, it's okay. Thanks, guy. It's fine. That's what I got this guy for. I appreciate it. It's all right. I know it looks like I'm struggling, but I do this for a living, so I appreciate that. Thank you, though. I really do appreciate it.
Always your help.
All right. Love is the wind blowing through your hair as the sun rises east of O'Hare, and as the light shines through, our souls are meant to be as two, and I will follow you into the dark. Well, love is eating Paris bread and riding through the park as we venture through the history of art. And if it rains, we'll make do, just as true lovers do. And I'll sleep next to you anywhere. Yeah, but I'll take a vow to love you for the rest of my life, every way I know how, to keep your spirit alive. You sheltered me, made a family. I'm not perfect, but I can try to be, and I need you here right next to me, forever and always, forever and always, forever and always, forever and always. Well, love is 5 beautiful children riding cross country, always packed to the brim, and when it rains, it pours. Ski treks and pushing old slow, but when I look To my left, I see my love. Oh, and love is growing old, getting heavy, watching the sunrise. With my love, yeah, my baby. But when you left me alone, I kept your heart and your soul wrapped up inside of my home that lives in my mind. Oh, it lives in my mind. Well, I'll take a vow to love you for the rest of my life, every way I know how, to keep your spirit alive. You sheltered me, made a family. I'm not perfect, but I can try to be, and I need you here right next to me, forever and always, forever and always, forever and always, forever and always. Thank you.
Thank you, Torin. For those who are here with us in person, I'll invite you to stand. El Malay Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamatzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Ashchina, Kedoshim U'Tohorim Kezoar Harakia Mazirim Et Nishmat Zender Baruch, Sholach Leolamo. Baal Harachamim, Yastir Rehu Beseter Kenafecha Leolamim, Bitzur Chaim Et Nishmato, Adonai Hu Nachalato. Yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo v'nomar. Amen. May the source of life, the fountain of all being, open our hearts to compassion and our eyes to wisdom, that we might glimpse in perfect peace the way of all things. May Sidney's memory be for us a blessing, and may we never let the light of his love grow dim in our hearts. May we remember all his worthy and righteous deeds, that his memory be forever bound up in the bond of life. May Sidney's death awaken us to this truth, that the bond of life and love that we shared and will always share can never be severed in sorrow. May he always rest in peace. We say together, Amen. Friends, at this time, we'll place the earth into the urn, into the grave. Thank you so much. You have the words of Mourner's Kaddish on the back of your pamphlet. In Jewish tradition, we say these words of Kaddish in the context of mourning, of grieving, of death. But the words aren't about that at all. They speak only about the gifts we know in life, the fact that life is a gift from God in its fullness. And it gives us a framework for how we might navigate our grief, perhaps through a lens of gratitude. Life is full, it's whole. And we have the choice when we mourn, we have the choice to choose what we remember, what we take with us, what that legacy we carry will be. And our tradition implores us to let it be one of gratitude. So think of Sidney, there's a lot to think about. Talk about rich, colorful, incredible memories that everyone who knew him has. No lack of content, no lack of imagery, no lack of sound. A full sensory experience. Not everybody has that sort of thing. And that's something for which to be grateful to. So call him into your mind's eye. Let his voice and his sound come into your ear. Feel him in your heart. Let's join together in the words. If you know them, they're written on the back of the pamphlet. If you don't know them or don't have them with you, as long as you say Amen at the end, you're credited with having said the entire prayer. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divarach yerutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agalau v'zman kar'i v'imru Amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam al'almei almaya, yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shemei dekudsha brichu, le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma v'imru Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim, Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru Amen. Osei shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru Amen. Zichrono livracha. May Sidney's memory always be a blessing. Amen. At this time, we'll invite those who are here who'd like to step forward. If you'd like to place earth into the grave, you are welcome to do so. This act in Jewish tradition is understood as really one of the highest and most selfless acts of care. And each person is sort of afforded the opportunity to fulfill this mitzvah entirely of their own accord. So if you participate, when you finish, if you place the shovel back down so each person can do this act completely, that is wonderful. Thanks, everyone. friends, this concludes our service here. The cemetery staff will come close the grave. Thank you so much.
Wonderful service. Thanks for everything.
Beautiful. Everyone's
Get a copy of what you
Of
said.
course. Thank you. I'll send it to you.
And for those of you that were viewing online, you can please log on to ChicagoJewishFunerals.com or Legacy.com to share your personal condolences to the family or personal stories of Mr. Zwick. Thank you. This does conclude the service.